Synchronicity, meaningful coincidence, potential versus kinetic energy. Are you ready? If we see a little rubber bouncy ball precariously balanced right on the tip of a knife blade, we know, at least in theory, that it wouldn't take much to push it off, and we can imagine as it fell from where it stood to the floor, bouncing to perhaps 2/3 its original height, falling, then bouncing less high and more rapidly, like a quarter spitting to silence on a countertop. Most people should be able to imagine this situation, see it in their minds, act it out, because although they may not have seen the exact situation before, they've seen enough situations like it that they know with common sense almost exactly what will happen. Why does it seem like more and more people have less and less common sense compared to, say, 1,500 years ago? We know much, much less when it comes to straight, narrow, common sense. Our minds are populated with irrational fears because we have no rational fears in real life. 4D crap, meat space. But the instincts to fight or die are the oldest, or perhaps maybe the second or the third oldest in our DNA. Much older than lobster hierarchies was one-on-one amoebas, and the amoeba with the best imagination won. Why? When your daily life becomes a complete joyride, an easy-peasy feast, orgy, and drug-induced dopamine roller coaster, you no longer need to evolve physically, so your body directs its energy to the mental. This is why we're so, as a global community, the EU and Anglosphere at least this is why we're obsessed currently with the notion of mental illness and PTSD, and of course the rape culture, because we never had time to notice these things. They were always here, but now we have time to notice them. Time. But don't take this out of context. Mental illness is going to be the battle of this generation, not because there's something wrong with our minds, but because there's something very, very, very wrong with the world. Externally, or it could just be perspective. Which is to say, if enough people simply change their perspective, the collective ripple in dimension 5 would be impossible to ignore down here. The effect would be like a toddler, a 3 or 4-year-old human child stepping into a puddle from the perspective of a dragonfly. This is just the phenomena of cause and effect, but synchronicity, meaningful coincidence, would be the unconscious ability, or I suppose conscious or not, the ability to see the child, see the puddle, know inherently what he will do, and act accordingly. So the dragonfly, leisurely feeding on smaller insects by the puddle without fear, because no fear is necessary, notices two things: a change in the air pressure, which implies movement, and a change in the way the light hits its eyes, which implies something larger than it is closer than it was, so it moves out of the way without thinking about it. Interdimensional chess. Nobody wins, nobody loses, and very few of us even know we're playing, which may be a problem. And I'm confident in assuming that a vast majority of the populace views the world in only 2 dimensions, and I understand that by design, a percentage of humanity needs to be here, in their place, by nature's law. But to have a healthy species, you need every individual to know his place, and this requires the assumption that there is order in this world, and everyone has a place, which most of us are not willing to accept, and those of us who are willing to accept that won't without an unhealthy attachment to a certain Jewish egregore. But that ship is soon to set sail, hopefully never to return. Speaking of dragonflies, have you ever seen them mate? They mate the same way worms do, only in flight. It's interesting to me how people cannot see the order in this world. Instead, they see the chaos of their minds, which is, as it should be, fire and water, that which impresses and that which is impressed upon, force and form, one and two. But it is severely out of balance, kind of like the Twin Towers. Or was there 3? Or 7? I think 3 of them fell. One of them, I think, was a hologram. At least that's what Led Zeppelin taught us. Simple math. Back to the topic at hand, however, synchronicity. Synchronicity is nothing more than fourth-dimensional prowess perceived from Dimension 3, where most of us reside, astrally speaking, or should, the bell curve. I don't think that's the case any longer. So insight of the fourth dimension, what does that look like in the third dimension? It looks like divine intervention, because our third-dimensional essence is still bound by time, but from Dimension 4, which would be first-person perception to the us acting on that plane, sees itself out of time, sees its third-dimensional body, and has the insight to recognize that it is God. Thou art that. The Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley. Read that book, but don't pay attention to most of it. What is that saying? The lips of wisdom are closed, but to the ears of understanding. Yeah. Okay, so we have the insight from Dimension 4 to realize that we're God. Okay, not the God, because that's just wordplay, which we'll get into later. But our fourth dimensional selves recognize that they can make time instead of being made by it. Thus, the entrepreneurs, anyone who is successfully self-employed, has fourth-dimensional prowess, which is in balance with the lower 3, enough so that it can move freely in this dimension of time. Right? Time, movement, force, and form. 4, 3, 2, 1. This is as high as Earth evolution goes, naturally, on its own, which is why we intervened. Divine intervention to you, but to us, we were just stepping into a puddle, and you, insects, acted accordingly. It's not hard to rise to the occasion when you've been down so long that it looks like up. But as I said, Dimension 2, perception of darkness and light, what it knows and what it wants, etherically infantile most of us are, and that's by conclusion, just as an observer, which is really my only title other than yours truly.